VenomousStare, the Starcraft 2 historian, returns with another Starcraft 2 video. This time we're doing one of those tier rankings that were popular a few months ago. I'm not so much for the trend following, but now that the dust has settled and it's officially uncool to do one of these videos, I thought, what the hell, let's talk some Starcraft, talk about these players, their strengths and weaknesses, and their careers overall. Because a lot of people have only been following Starcraft for a handful of years, or might be new, and the guys that I'm the biggest fan of aren't even on this list. So whenever I get to a younger player who hasn't had a chance to really solidify their career, I'm not going to say, oh, they're terrible just because they're, compared to Dark, they're not that good. I'm just going to drop them and rank another and talk about an old school player. So let's start out with a few Gosus, some people that really define the game and you really need to know about at the front end of this video. I don't really want to do it alphabetically, I think that's kind of drab. Let's start with ByuN. ByuN is one of the best Terrans ever. He was best in 2016, right at the beginning of Legacy of the Void. He's most famous for winning a GSL whenever you pretty much had to be on a Kespa team, which, if you don't know, Kespa is the old sort of ruling esports organization body in Korea, and basically if you think of a Kespa team, it's like SK1, KT Rolster, all these legendary big names that you've not only seen back in the Pro League days of StarCraft 1 and 2, but these were like the biggest names when like League of Legends was on the come up back in 2012 out in Korea. And whenever Heart of the Swarm came out in 2013, the Kespa players switched over. Flash, Bisu, Jaedong, these top tier guys, the gods of StarCraft 1, Kespa didn't allow them to switch over to StarCraft 2 back when Wings of Liberty dropped in 2010. Only really the B teamers were allowed to switch over. Fruit Dealer, Hope Torture, these sort of guys. And they were still incredible. Korea was so insanely deep, and that really allowed for Korea to dominate StarCraft 2, even though you look at some of these legendary names, MVP, B teamer in StarCraft 1, MMA, Bomber, B-teamers in StarCraft 1. Idra, B-teamer in StarCraft 1. And then when the Kespa switch happened, and all the god-tier Koreans came over at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm, that was when I think you really saw the highest level of the game as far as most influx of talent. Because obviously, as we go on in time, people are always improving, always getting better. It's not like if you go look at Heart of the Swarm games, people are doing better and more intelligent things and playing more crisply than we see now. I just mean in terms of all the biggest names, there was no one back in Brood War. If you look at Brood War now, Flash, either in Brood War or in the military and was playing Brood War, like Flash is playing Brood War, Jaedong's back to playing Brood War, Rain is back to playing Brood War, Stork, like these are pretty much like the best four Brood War players, big picture, efforts playing Brood War. All these guys switched to StarCraft at some point. Flash was really high level at StarCraft 2, made it to multiple finals, Home Story Cup, MLG Dallas 2013, but he wasn't like untouchable, jaw-dropping, unbeatable like he was in StarCraft 1. So, point being, when all of those god-tier Koreans came over, that little era from like 2013 to 2016, was just a bloodbath for the non-Kespa guys. It's very difficult for a lot of them to win. A lot of them, like Symbol, sort of got phased out, that late like 2012 era player. And there were so many great Koreans that came over initially, like your Roros and players like that, that because Blizzard stepped in and made it where had less GSLs and tried to do this weird Forest Riot Games ripoff, WCG USA and all this crap at WCS. It just didn't work, and a lot of those exceptional players got phased out. But most importantly here, as we get back on topic, that was just a little overarching history to sort of contextualize what we're about to talk about. In 2016, ByuN Teamless really just ripped through the ladder and ripped through the GSL. If we were thinking about what he was doing and what made him so good, the 3-Rax Reaper was his bread and butter. This was a cheesy build that he sort of pioneered and got nerfed. Very rarely in StarCraft are people so incredibly good at a certain build that it becomes like theirs. For instance, Parting with the Immortal Century Soul Train all-in at the end of 2012. Other people like to do that build, it was very popular, but no one was better at it than Parting. It was definitively his build, he was god tier at it. And he sort of got it nerfed. In the same way that ByuN was so good with 3-Rax Reaper, he got the Reaper nerfed. He was also the reason that they took tank evac out of the game, where you could drop tanks straight down, like he would do these vicious pushes first Zerg with the tank medevac. He was really the only guy who truly understood how to abuse that. And when you really think about ByuN, the main thing you think about is his micro. This is a guy with like Marine King level, jaw dropping, blow your doors off, holy shit level micro. So ByuN was just so fun to watch, and it truly is a travesty that whenever we watch him now, it's so sad because he has such severe wrist issues. It's affecting his play. He literally has to pause to like rub his wrists, and it's just so sad. Usually in esports, you don't really think of people having like debilitating health issues, but it's just awful to see a guy that everyone loves and everyone cheer for, a true fan favorite, to really not even be able to play. But absolute Gosu level, and really before Maru took the throne from him and won all those GSLs, that was because ByuN went into the military, by the way. Maru's success was predicated off of ByuN going into the military in many ways. ByuN was incredible. He came back and was great. This was also a guy who was playing since the first GSL, playing freaking Protoss. So he's old school. And it's really interesting to note, for years he was known as one of those like micro, cheesy, push-based Terrans, sort of like a Marine King, one of these obnoxious guys who would throw you off guard. Obnoxious with his play, not in his personality, sort of abusive and aggressive, but he parlayed that style into being able to macro really well, always keeping pressure on his opponents. And whenever you think about someone who is truly representative of the race and understands like what Terran is about, like Maru and ByuN are at the top of that list. When I think about the way they micro their drops, the annoying ways that they abuse map terrain, the amount that they're willing to cheese with 2 racks and 3x Reaper in ByuN's case, these guys get it. These guys get Terran, so ByuN is right up there at the top of the list as a legend. Since we're talking about legends, we gotta go with Dark next. This is a guy who, since Heart of the Swarm, has been a top 2 Zerg in Korea. It's him and Rogue at the top. Dark is a very safe, methodical macro player. He's also willing to mix in cheeses. Not really as abusive as Rogue. That's sort of why Rogue has won so much. Rogue will do the double Niduses. He'll do the Roach Bust if you watch the last GSL finals. Even if you play Zerg, it's like, this is kind of gross, like what we're watching. But Dark doesn't really play so abusively. He's sort of the more straight up macro player, but he's not so macro focused he'll never cheese. I think his cheeses are almost more of like, I'm mixing it in to balance my range. Whereas if you think about the way that some of these other guys cheese, it's not really like that so much. Like Rogue really loves cheesing. Like he takes a perverse sense of pleasure in it, where I feel like Dark is almost like, I'm going to show you this so you respect me and you don't just play really greedy. So let's mix in a non-Gosu. Dark is great, but he makes the Gosu because of his consistency in GSL, and he's done decently in other foreigner tournaments. And I just look at Dark and you have to respect him, but he's not the sort of guy that you get all fired up. Oh, Dark is on like Maru, ByuN, these guys. You're going to see some wicked shit, some really impressive, fun to watch stuff. Dark is, it's more drab in the way that he plays. It's more just correct macro Zerg. Let's mix it up a tad. Let's rank Bly, who I think is the only person who has the better stare than me in the Starcraft 2 scene. This Ukrainian Zerg, handsome guy, very aggressive, loves that really obnoxious proxy hatch Roach Ravager build. Bly popularizes stuff like that. He loves to run Banes in your mineral lines to fuck up your economy. He'll mix in the 2 hatch Muta build. He'll mix in the Nidus build. Bly, although capable of playing macro styles relatively well, is your prototypical cheesy Zerg. And when you're looking for sort of one of these obnoxious ladder builds to mix in a best of 3, or maybe even just steal some ladder points with, I think Bly is the guy that you look to and can really do that with a smile. Armani, we're going to rank it very good. This is a guy who went all the way to round of 4 a couple GSLs ago. And it's interesting to me because he had his military service coming up at him, and he wasn't really a successful enough pro gamer to delay it. And I think Armani is an interesting story, as my nose is just profoundly itchy, because Armani basically said to himself, look, this is my last GSL, I have to absolutely try hard, do everything that I can to make it as far as I can, practice as much as possible, and he made it all the way to the round of 4 until he was smashed by Maru. Now if you look at Armani's play, he doesn't really have anything historical that's interesting, really. He got so good at making it to 66 drones and 1-1 upgrades against Terran. Oftentimes he looked like he would get to that point in the game and be like, okay, what do I do now? Solid guy, but sort of one that was middling round of 16 tier for a very long time, had a really good run, and now has sort of fallen back to earth. And another thing is, whenever these guys who are sort of, even though they are literally in Code S, they always lose in the round of 16 in Code S. Myung-sik comes to mind. When these guys have these runs with a round of 4 and then they never get close again, a lot of times it's predicated off of they have upcoming military service and they truly go all in, like Goku level training on their practice, or they get a bunch of a good matchup in a row. Like for instance Myung-sik, when he made his big run, a lot of it was predicated off of him beating Zergs. He was really good at playing against Zerg. That happened with Armani, where his run was predicated off of a lot of good versus Terran. And he doesn't make the S-class level because he hasn't had that consistency before or after his round of 4, and his play isn't really inspired. He's sort of just standard, and that's not really that interesting, because if you look at all the 3 races, the Zergs, they're the races that have the best non-Koreans. They have Serral and Raynor, who are both completely capable of, making deep runs in Code S, and both of those guys are probably Gosu levels. So the foreigners have always been best at Zerg and worst at Terran, especially America. Alright, let's do another Gosu. Serral, if you just look at this guy, his resume speaks for himself. I was out here talking about Serral in 2015. In the Heart of the Swarm era, I was watching Moro stream, and Moro played this epic game on Overgrowth Facility, which you can find on my channel. And Moro was like saying, even though I won this game, Serral's going to be sick good. He doesn't waste any time cheesing, he only macros really. And Serral essentially took that Idra mindset of straight macro, honorable defensive play style and made it flawless. This is a guy who's very hard to tilt, very rarely over drones, and he just understands Zerg in this bizarre way that you almost only really see from Rogue. Is the only other Zerg that you watch and just are sort of like, yeah, I can't believe you won like that, and even though you could win like that. A lot of the way that Zerg players developed macro-wise and mentally was like, how do we stop this abusive thing, and figuring out how to defend stuff. And the thing that Rogue and Serral have done that really jumps out at me is they're so good at that defensive style, but they can also kill their opponent in ways that seem abnormal. I mean, Serral's obviously Gosu level. Probably the best foreigner in Starcraft 2 history, in fact. Alright, let's rank innovation. He's going to go up at the Gosu level. So if you look at the career trajectory of innovation, back when he first entered the scene in 2013, which I'm going to do a whole nother series of videos on that little era, absolutely god tier, untouchable. He of course ripped through that GSL season all the way up until his finals versus Sulky. That was one of the best GSL runs of all time, just absolutely jaw-dropping what he did on his way to that finals, which of course had a tragic ending. However, this is a guy who made multiple finals since then and won. This is a guy who plays in a methodical, honorable, macro way that doesn't ever really deviate or rely on tricks or gimmicks. This is a guy that if my life was on the line, like if aliens came to Earth, the old Thorn scenario, and they were like, "Well, Venom, who are you gonna, pick to protect your life?" I'm gonna say innovation, because you might say, "Well, what about Maru or TY or Rogue?" It's like, no, like those guys might do some weird shit like proxy hatch, Nidus, like 2 racks in the best of 7 over and over, which might actually be good. But innovation, I'd put my life in the guy's hands because I know how he's going to play, and I know that he's good at it. And whenever I think about methodical, peak level ByuN versus Mutiling, Terran versus Zerg, I just think of this stream of Terran units coming across the map, and Innovation just mercilessly grinding a Zerg down until he has so many mines that he literally can't engage, and then after he wins, just like doing that little Innovation smirk and looking over at the Zerg like you were dead 10 minutes ago. Like, I love Innovation, he's the shit. S-Class, Neeb. This is a guy who literally made it to S-Class, made it all the way to the round of 4 and lost to either Dark or Rogue. Sometimes it's easy to conflate them for obvious reasons. I think it was Dark. But anytime you can make it to the round of 8 or better in GSL as a foreigner, you're solidified as legendary. Remember, we're talking Scarlett, Idra, Jinro, and Neeb here. Round of 8 or better in the GSL. This is so incredibly rare. Oh, and Naniwa squeaked in there at the end of Wings of Liberty, and Naniwa actually ran into the MVP meat grinder. And hilariously, Naniwa did an interview with Thorin where he talks about that series and how Korean pro gamers that he was like in a team with and practice partners with were sharing replays against him. And if you look at that series versus MVP, the things he was saying sort of line up. But it's worth noting Naniwa is also on that list. And anyway, if you make it that far in GSL, you're a god tier foreigner. We're not talking super tournament. We're talking long form GSL where your opponents can prepare for you and conspire against you, because that's really what it's all about. There's a big difference between winning a weekend tournament, an MLG style tournament, and a GSL. That's why winning a normal long form GSL is so prestigious and is so hard. I remember seeing a banner. It was like in the GSL studios of the GSL winners. Just all 3-syllable Korean names. Jae Lee Dong, K Lee Sim, like stuff like that. Like, there's a reason you don't see any American ass names on there. Because the Koreans, it's a point of pride. None of them wants to be the guy that loses to the foreigner, especially in GSL. You know, it's bad when a Korean guy flies to an MLG Dallas and he's jet lagged as shit, and you know he feels culture shocked and out of place, and he's only been out of Korea a couple times, and he loses to some guy in an open bracket in an MLG that he's never heard of, who's like CJet Galsy and is like a cannon Russian god or something. But this is why the GSL is so difficult and winning one is so prestigious. Is because if you're the foreigner, none of the Koreans want you to win the GSL. And they're going to try to help each other, especially if they lose against you, to help the other GSL players beat you. So that's part of why foreigners never won a GSL. Speaking of foreigners, let's rank Scarlett. This is a player who has been insidiously powerful and a very, very good macro Zerg since Wings of Liberty. If we look at Wings of Liberty, at the end, she was exceptional. And if we look at the BWC 2012, which was sort of one of those nationalistic tournaments where the players compete for the pride of their countries and then they go and face the other best players from the other countries, Scarlett was top tier. She beat Vibe and Idra to win the BWC. And to me, the thing that always jumps out about Scarlett's play is her creep spread. Scarlett has just this incredible creep spread that forks all across the map and is so all-encompassing and fastidious. That's the one thing I think that I really try to incorporate into my play that I watch, is just look at how good Scarlett's creep spread is. It's not about APM necessarily only, because a lot of Zerg players have high APM and can just spread 50 tumors to the middle. With Scarlett, it's the way that she forks and soaks the map in creep. All the little back paths, all the little corner bases, forking up into the top of the map. Scarlett is so diligent about her creep spread. And what I think is just so incredibly important to note about Scarlett's career, I spoke about how good she was in Wings. This is a player who, Heart of the Swarm came in, and at the end of Wings of Liberty, you had shows like State of the Game and whatnot that would frequently talk like, oh, how are foreigners going to do in Heart of the Swarm? Are we going to see sort of like the beginning of Wings of Liberty where players like Kiwi Kaki are able to compete with the Koreans? And a lot of times these talk show hosts would be like, oh yeah, you're going to see that. Like, the beginning of HOTS is going to be good for foreigners. Not the case. The beginning of HOTS was a butcher's den for foreigners. Foreigners never had a worse time from the beginning of HOTS to the end, to like probably the middle end of HOTS. Not a good time to be a foreigner. You had that absolutely atrocious WCS nonsense going on where it wasn't even like soft region lock, just a disaster. Scarlett was the only player, the only foreigner really who was doing well at this time from the Americas. You had Stefano and Snoot like popping off a bit in Europe, but Scarlett was really out there consistently, and we remember she played that classic game against Bomber on Habitation Station during this era. And even now into Legacy, Scarlett has made the GSL and has had longevity, so one of the best foreigners ever, Scarlett, and definitely Gosu level. DongRaeGu, we're going to put him at S-Class. This is another guy who has longevity to his advantage. He's won an MLG against Marine King, which was, if you look at the history of StarCraft 2 and sort of like the fun peak, again, I'm not talking like a skill level at the game because it's just been going up and up and up since the beginning. Obviously Legacy's better now, but if I think about when I enjoyed StarCraft 2 the most, it was like the 2012 era, like when all the Koreans were sort of coming over to the MLGs. That was amazing, and those events were so fun to go to. There was a premier tournament every week. DongRaeGu was popping off at this time. This is the master of Mutiling Baneling. Heart of the Swarm, he had to go to the military. It looked like he was going to be done. Then he came back in Legacy of the Void, was absolutely god tier versus Terran, and did some real damage in the GSL until a couple seasons ago when it looked like he was going to go into a match against TY and be scary because he's a Mutiling Baneling player, always has been, and he just got railroaded by going Hydra 3 games in a row. I still don't know what the hell that was about. That was really bizarre to watch, but DongRaeGu, great player who gets bumped up into S-Class because of his longevity and because his style is one of the most fun Zergy styles to watch in Zerg versus Terran. Ain't nobody want to see someone die to roaches. Alright, we'll do a ranking of their Gung Fu Band. As far as I know, this guy pretty much just abuses air. Not hating on him, but let's talk about GraeGu Fields, who I would certainly rank in the Gosu level. Made it all the way to the GSL round of 4, won an MLG, won an IPL, won an NASL, did significant damage in Brood War, and was the best foreigner at the end of Brood War for foreigners. Obviously like Flash was better, but alright, that's your little Idra bit. Skillos, we'll do another. We'll do Huck. Huck was S-Class. This was a guy that won 2 MLGs in a year, did some damage in the GSL, got too much flack for being an overly aggressive player, but ultimately wasn't as good in Brood War as Idra and didn't have as much career longevity or career accomplishments as Idra. Even though they were rivals, I would rank Huck just a touch below, and even though he wasn't like a completely cheesy, abusive player, he was an aggressive, tempo-setting Protoss. So, definitely Huck and very good, or S-Class, whatever I said initially. S-Class, because of the 2 MLG wins. And also, Idra had the most popular stream at the time, and gets a little bit of bonus points for that. If you had like a top tier stream that was, you know, the very top of Twitch TV, literally more popular than League of Legends players, ushered in the popularity of Twitch as we know it, you do get just a little sprinkling of extra credit for that. Ragnarok, we're going to put it very good. This is a perennial round of 16 exiting GSL player who will look really good one week and then look like he didn't practice at all the next week and he has to play. He has no consistency at all, and he's not really a guy that you can really look at or rely on in any regard. He's been around for a long freaking time though. Dream is another guy I'm going to rank it very good, and you might be saying, how are you literally ranking people in Code S or S-Class and very good? Because S-Class doesn't literally mean that you make it into GSL and get knocked out in the first round every season. S-Class means that you're a legitimate threat to actually win a Code S, and you're at that level. So guys like Ragnarok and Dream, who are really only good at one matchup and you can never count on, are going to get bumped down to very good. Like, even if Dream got to play versus Zerg, which is his best matchup, all the way through, he still wouldn't really be a real threat of winning a GSL. He's just one of these guys that has a few upset seasons, has a little bit of pop. He's very solid, but he doesn't have the pedigree of a Neeb or a DRG, like a multi-time title winner. And he certainly doesn't have like the jaw-dropping consistency of your Gosu level player. Creator. This guy's going to actually fall into decent. He was solid in 2011 in the GSL. He pioneered actually I'm going to do solid because he is like he's made it to multiple GSLs. But this isn't a guy who, even though he's made it into some Legacy of the Void GSLs that anybody fears, he's going to go for sort of an archaic double upgrade style or sort of like a poorly executed cheese. In 2011, this guy was considered a good macro Protoss when we really saw Korean Protoss like wasting quite a bit of their talent. You didn't really have a sea of decisive authoritarian players like MC, and you really didn't have any pure macro guys like Rain or Stats at the time. So really Protoss, you had your really cheesy players who had a lot of holes in their play, and your tempo setters like Huck and MC. A lot of people thought, like, maybe this wasn't true, but the impression from a lot of people was sort of like they couldn't really play a defensive macro style. Their success is predicated off of aggression. But I digress. Mana, we're going to rank it solid because he won a tournament back in 2011 and actually years later won another major tournament when no one thought he had a chance. And Mana and his 3-gate Robo build versus Terran is actually the reason that Artosis switched to Protoss. Artosis said that he didn't feel comfortable in PvT and didn't feel like there was a legitimate way to get into the mid game, but after he saw that Mana build, that's when he finally switched. So between that and the 2 majors with all that time in between, he definitely gets a point in solid. If you were to enter a Starcraft 2 like open bracket, you wouldn't want to face Mana. This is like an established, experienced player with some consistency behind him. So Harstem, I'm going to sort of just drop into the decent category because he'll win one best of 3 versus a good player, and you see this Year of Harstem meme spammed ad nauseum. This isn't a guy that is any threat to get into the round of 4 consistently. He's just sort of a guy who's a perennial flash in the pan. He likes to sing when he plays. Just never really thought much of him. Not that I dislike him as a guy, or I even think he's that bad, but just when I see, he's playing Harstem, like, I don't feel like Harstem's going to show me any exciting build or really stymie a really good Korean player. He's just sort of an average European player. So obviously it's a tier list, guys. Not everyone's going to be Gosu. Hero Marine, I would actually put this guy at very good. A consistent, methodical German macro Terran. He's made it to BlizzCons before. He's a real threat in a lot of the tournaments. If you look at something like Home Story Cup, Hero Marine is a mainstay at that. He's been around since Wings, back when he was wearing the Harry Potter glasses. And he's always been a guy that tries to play correctly, and a player that doesn't really rely on tricks or gimmicks. He doesn't really have the punching power to make it to round of 4s or finals consistently. He's more of a guy that you think of as like the guy that loses to a good Korean in the round of 8 or round of 16. Pretty good stream though, and just overall solid player. Raynor, we're going to put at the Gosu level. This is a guy who punches right up there with Serral, just as good as a lot of the Koreans. And he's a very scary guy who, if we think about this era from Legacy of the Void on, it's very heavily dominated by Serral and Raynor. And shit, half the time one of them loses, it's the other one knocking them out. So you have to really think about that when you think about Serral and Raynor, is how many times have we seen round of 8, round of 4, or fucking finals been Serral versus Raynor? A lot of times. It's very frequent. So I don't hold Raynor in the same sort of like infallible, godlike esteem that I think Serral is at. Raynor is more of a guy that can mix in your Roach Ravager aggression. He plays a little bit more like Rogue. Future, we're going to drop into the rank another. We're going to do Rhett. Rhett was very good, a methodical macro player who basically people would always say that if he would practice consistently and basically as hard as a guy like Idra practice, he would be nearly unstoppable. Thing that sticks out to me about Rhett is his peaks. Not only did Rhett have a major tournament win, I think it was like a DreamHack Assembly, but Rhett was like the only foreigner that I would see who you would go into the game thinking like, kind of having like not very high expectations, because the last tournament you saw Rhett play at, he didn't look good or practiced, and he would literally play against MVP and Wings of Liberty at MVP's peak and just obliterate him 2-0. Shouldn't even be possible, even for like the best Korean Zerg like Nesty at the time. Just fucking unfathomable the stuff that Rhett would do, and he really deserves his own Venomous Classic series, which by the way, I've been wanting to do, but there's a big problem. Like with a lot of the series I want to cast for that series, it's just gone. Like between DMC Avarice and Twitch VODs being nuked, and none of these companies really caring enough to properly catalog anything, it's hard to find a lot of this shit. So hopefully Rhett can get the credit he's due in the Venomous Classic series soon. Maru, Gosu level player, has won multiple GSLs, right up there with ByuN in defining how the race is watched and how you think about players. Just an incredible player. Again, understands what is strong about Terran, mixes in 2 racks a shitload, drops with a ton of moxie. Just an incredible player. He's known as the 4th race for a reason. Parting, another Gosu level player, and if we consider why, Maru played in the very first GSL. Parting was at his peak in 2012, was destroying BlizzCon, he was destroying BWC, a lot of it predicated off of the Immortal Century build. Absolutely lights out. He was in that infamous group of death with life and innovation in the middle and heart of the swarm. Very fun to watch. One of the Koreans who makes a real effort to learn and speak in English, very charismatic, and he's done some real damage in the recent GSLs. He's very aggressive. This is a TOS player that will open Forge first on your ass. This is a TOS player who is not afraid to do blink all-ins. He's been great for a long time, and he has a lot of tournament top 4s under his belt. SOS, S-Class. This is a player who I think plays Protoss in the way that it really needs to be played mentally, and he's the last sort of player that I would want to have to face off against if I was playing against him. And he doesn't really have the consistency to be put at the Gosu class, because this guy will just have the most insane flameouts and lose to players who are so much worse than him. But SOS, he will vary between insidiously cheesy and very macro focused. He'll do the most ludicrously abusive all-ins imaginable and then play macro for 3 games in a row. If we look at a range, 1 being insanely cheesy, 10 being pure macro, one of the only players in the whole fucking game that can truly play 1 to 10 scale. And I think that's what makes Protoss scary, and this is a big reason why SOS has been to many finals and can really just rip through the competition, because if you play against someone like that, it's sick. It's sick what they can do to you. Zest is another guy that has sort of had a lot of highs and lows, and sometimes when Zest plays, it's like, who the hell was that? That was atrocious. Like, what is he doing? Why is he still doing shitty Adept all-ins or like 2-base Colossus? Then other times you watch Zest and it's like, oh, this is how you beat Terran. This is literally the meta. And Zest is a guy like SOS who has multiple tournament finals and is a perennial threat to go deep, but is also a guy who you wouldn't really feel confident against if your life was on the line, because he might just do some random bullshit and you could die in a very stupid way. So Zest loses out on Gosu because of that, but is right there at S-Class because he's been a top tier Protoss player for like 7 or 8 years. Rogue and S-Class sicko, and when I say S-Class, you can see me do like a Freudian slip, because I don't even really like to watch Rogue. This is a guy who just pulls out all the stops of abuse, double Nidus, swarm host abuse, road sling. He's truly shameless. I don't really like to watch guys like that, even though, and it's not like I'm knocking him. He obviously is trying his best to win and winning money at tournaments, but I like to watch innovation. People be ground down with methodical, honorable macro play, Rogue is like the Zerg that you lose to in 1v1 and you're like, God, this guy, I can't believe the way he plays. Rogue has like made a career off of that, but his results speak for himself. He's won a shitload of international tournaments, multi-time GSL winner, but he's a sicko. He's a dirty, dirty Zerg. Dirty Zerg. Special, aka Juanito. This is a guy we're going to have to drop into S-Class because multi-time GSL winner, or excuse me, that's not true. Multi-time GSL qualifier. Out of foreigners, this is a guy who has been in GSL the most consistently. If we sort of take away like the first year and a half of Wings of Liberty, Special is up and around GSL all the time. He played in Pro League. He's truly committed to the game, and he's also round of four at a shitload of international tournaments. If we think about that like 2016 era, it was like felt like it was him and Nerchio in any semifinals on one side of the bracket or the other. Juanito was also exceptional in Brood War. You know, Major, Ghosty Terran, Special, Kitty, Anna Prosser, the man of many IDs. And if he was more consistent in GSL, and I think he would be moved up to the Gosu level, but perhaps he should be in the Gosu level because if we look at American Terrans in StarCraft 2, he's like the only one who's even worth a shit. What are you going to say, like Masa? What has Masa done? He's 2-racked people in a couple international tournaments. Special is literally over in Korea, competing and being very threatening, making it to the round of 8, but I haven't seen that consistency in Juan to put him up in the Gosu level, because it seems like a lot of times, and I'm not trying to be mean, it seems like a lot of times when Juanito gets to that big moment, he chokes. I remember one series where he was playing a Protoss player, it might have been Stats, it was deep in the GSL, and he looked like he had just completely won, and he just gargled like huge disruptor shots for 10 minutes and blew his big lead. He's had a lot of round of 4 games against Zerg players in international tournaments where he just sort of looks like he's playing in molasses and isn't that sharp. So Juanito, just a touch short of Gosu, but gets a ton of credit for being the best foreigner Terran in StarCraft 2 by fucking far. Drogo, this is a guy who I would rank as decent. Shown some flashes of brilliance. He had some really insidiously abusive force field aggression builds back in HOTS, but he doesn't really have the consistency or pop to, I think, be ranked higher. Hellraiser, I'm just going to drop into rank another because this is not really a guy who has done much. He's just sort of like your mediocre European Zerg. Let's talk about Nest-T, one of the best Korean Zergs of Wings of Liberty. He would be ranked at Gosu. Literally has the award for most consecutive, like 10, if you make 10 GSLs in a row, it's called the Nest-T Award. This is a guy who pioneered Zerg macro play and took the reins from Fruit Dealer, who had made a Venomous Classic about Fruit Dealer, the first great Korean Zerg. Nest-T took the reins from him and really perfected Korean macro Zerg. Kel'Thuzar, I'm going to rank at solid, although he was very good for a time. This guy's just a step below Juan in the best foreigner Terran race, but this is a guy who I think has fallen off super hard in the last 3 or 4 years. That 2016 era where Nerchio was really good, yeah, Kel'Thuzar was scary, but he's solid. He's a good little macro Terran, but personally, like, you know, I wouldn't really look to him to learn how to play the race or anything like that. Time, I would put it very good. Time is weird because you don't really get to see much from the Chinese scene. They're sort of off doing their own thing, and then they come to like GSL versus the world, and you sort of see what level they're at. And for the past few tournaments, whenever Time comes, he just shows he's absolutely legendary, especially versus Zerg. His TVT is really good too. It's really hard to get a gauge on him, and he's never really in GSL, so that limits him. Soul, solid, Polish, I believe, Terran player. Good micro, doesn't really have the tournament results to be ranked much more than solid, but a very good foreigner Terran. Showtime, I would rank it very good. He had a little stretch where he looked just as good as the Korean players, made a BlizzCon, was really blowing people away, but to me this isn't a guy that is good enough at the cheesy or abusive aspects of Protoss to be really scary. He's sort of just like a scuffed version of Stats. Not really the sort of guy who's a paragon, but has had enough results and has been consistently good enough to be ranked in the very good category. Stats, Gosu level, the best defensive macro Protoss there is and has been for like 7 years. This is a guy who plays a lot like Innovation or Artosis and Brood War, just completely defensively, honorable, macro, focused, defensive, reacts to what you're doing, gets a quick third. This guy, if you're trying to figure out how to play honorably and properly, is the one you want to look at. Max Packs, I would rank it solid. This is a creative, cheesy player that Beastie QT popularized. He hasn't really won much or even been to many tournaments, but he has a shitload of creativity and is fun to watch, so he gets put at solid just because he's basically like, even though like Harstam and Pit Drogo have made it to like, you know, have played in group stages of tournaments, I guess I'd have to put Max Packs at decent because he doesn't have any tournament results, but he's more well known. Solar, very good. This is a guy, much like Armani and Ragnarok, round of 16 quality. Solar is a lot like Ragnarok, except he's a little bit better. And when he looks really good for round of 16, he'll look really good for round of 8 too, and then he'll look terrible. So, just not consistent. Not really a huge fan of his. TY, Gosu level, one of the 4 horsemen, understands late game Terran than any other player. Absolute legend, also casting GSL for the Koreans, multi-time winner. This is a guy who really understands how to play the race on a late game level and is a sicko, really talented. Estrella was in GSL, had a good game, but to me, really hit or miss career. He gets solid because he made a GSL, and I do see him in a lot of these foreigner tournaments that I used to go to, but really not a guy that you're going to be terrified of, but not really a real cheesy guy either, but a creative player. A laser, very good Polish Zerg player. He in that 2016-2017 air show era, he was very solid. He's a guy that'll mix in the proxy roach cheese as well, and overall was a threat to win tournaments for a long time, but not really someone you would ever expect to make it to round of 8 of a GSL. Bunny, very good. Famous for his picking up tank and medevac pushes versus Zerg. Scary player, but definitely a cut below, like everyone you see on this list and this list that plays Terran. And just really, he's a guy that you're never really going to be able to root for in the sense of winning a finals. Just sort of solid. As I have nothing to drink over here. Great. Zaun, very good, creative, aggressive Protoss, lots of different builds, but he's more of a recent player and we don't really have the track record to rank him properly yet, but I heckin' love to watch him. Thermal, solid, one of the best foreigner Terrans, big mouth, sort of a softie, said he was favored versus Serral in a best of 7 just because he won some online games off of him once. Sort of a pompous, ridiculous character, but, you know, he's solid. Trap, S-Class. Basically, if you look at how Stats plays, Trap is just a step below him, but will also mix in more cheeses. Trap also been around since Brood War, and just a very consistent, like, top 4 Protoss in Korea for years. But he's not quite Gosu level, because he's just... To me, it's like he's second best at a lot of things. He's like second best at Stats' methodical macro style. He's second best at, you know, being aggressive like parting or doing builds like that. He's sort of second best to being weird and creative and keeping people off balance. He's just sort of like 9 out of 10 at a lot of different stuff. Occur, solid Terran, will put it very good. Not much to be said about him. And the rest of these guys, okay, well... Lambo's solid. This is a guy who's creative and does make good guide videos, but overall, like, you're really not thinking, oh, Lambo's going to make it to the round of 4 and really fuck me up. You're thinking, like, playing against Lambo, he's solid, he's like top 50 GM on Europe, he knows what he's doing, but he's less scary than a laser, say. and he's certainly scarier than Serral or fucking Raynor, but he's no slouch. And then Stefano gets put up at Gosu, and even though Stefano's career began like at a 10 out of 10, and he had incredible longevity and just gradually went downhill as he was like going to school full time and just doing incredible things academically, still he was at like an 8.5 plus out of everyone in the game for like 4 years. If we look at Wings of Liberty, he was soul-crushing, god-tier level, the guy that sort of took the throne from Idra for best Korean or best foreigner Zerg. Just fucking insane how good this guy was. Would go to events hungover as shit after flying 15 hours, would lose his keyboard at the airport and would play with some like random backup keyboard in top 4. The guy was a monster. He was so good versus Protoss. He really understood how to use the Infestor. Just an absolute god from France. And then in the Wings of Liberty era ended, he still transitioned into an insidiously powerful Heart of the Swarm player whenever WCS Europe was basically like GSL, Code S, like, you know, players like MVP, a lot of them went over to Europe and was like, well, it's like Code A basically. Stefano was one of the few guys that could punch with those Koreans. Stefano's fucking god tier. He's just a great guy overall. Marine Lord, Vanye. Okay, so the rest of these guys, I guess Klim could be sorted into decent, but the rest of these guys I'm just going to dump here and talk about old school players. So we'll do MVP, Gosu. MVP was the best Terran player for Wings of Liberty. He was incredible at series planning. He could play mech and bio very well, and wrist issues kept him from having the longevity that his career should have had, but he was a real jaw dropper and even qualified for a few GSLs years later. Katz will qualify into solid. Katz is a very good creative player that had a lot of impact on the scene outside of the server with his Root clan. Very funny, and overall a great guy and a positive contribution to the scene. Alright, we'll move one more over and think about another old school player. We'll do Machine. We'll put him in solid too. Machine was a guy that played a standard macro approach at an above average, amiable level. Very nice guy and overall positive influence to the scene. And that's one thing that I think sort of jumps out at me is like going to events now, or even like in 2017 or 18 as opposed to like 2011, 2012. Even though Machine was never going to win like MLG Dallas, it was still fun to see him and to see how far he would go. He was like a positive force on the scene, and we've lost a lot of people like that who they weren't necessarily going to beat the Code S level Koreans, but they were really good guys. You know, like there was people that you could look forward to meeting. Couldn't necessarily call them friends, but you could meet and talk to them and they would remember you, and you know, you could establish a rapport, and it was just great. You could talk about stuff you saw on their stream, and we lack a lot of that. And when people really say like, oh, I miss the old days, and I'm talking about retro players, so obviously I do too to some extent, but I don't miss the old days because of like the level of the play. Like people have been improving ever since the game came out. A lot of the reason that you miss the old days is because of the people that you had to deal with. And I think that's really what a lot of people sort of like, the disconnect in their brain is like, oh, I missed 2012. We missed 2012 because you could walk into an MLG and see all the old EG guys and fucking all of Startail and all of Root. You know, being a Starcraft 2 fan in that time was magical. And now you go to an event and Starcraft 2 is sort of off in the corner. You know, we're not the biggest and baddest thing anymore. And it's in a place like the internet where time moves faster. You were never, as a hardcore 1v1, like slit your throat level difficulty type game, you were never going to be able to be number one forever. Because there are games, like team games like League of Legends, where you go into the server, shit it up, crybaby a bit, and queue up again. And like that's the process. It's never your fault. You never have to take accountability. You can play like 5 games of Starcraft before you have to start like taking accountability and looking inward and reflecting at why you're bad and what you have to do to improve. that's too much for most people, man. They'd rather fucking go play a team game and like dick around. So anyway, we got 2 more people to rank. Both are obviously going to go here. Denver's going to get dropped down so I can talk about the Gosu that was Startail Life. I have an entire series of videos over this guy, but here's what you need to know. This guy was an absolutely blow your doors off, god level, Gosu, jaw-dropping level player, the sort of player that an entire race of Zerg players looked up to and tried to mirror their style around. A metagame innovator, a legend, and just a guy that played with extreme ferocity and was really a pleasure to watch. So that starts out live. And finally, we'll do Flash. Obviously, Flash is the best pro gamer of all time, and even if we're thinking about strictly StarCraft 2 level here, Flash was a perennial threat to be in the top 4 of a GSL, a perennial threat to win foreign tournaments, finalist at MLG Dallas 2013, finalist at a DreamHack years later, or a Homestar Cup against Parting, and just always incredible, fun to watch, better than fucking Faker in League of Legends, better than Cooler in Quake, better than Simple in CS. This motherfucker was the baddest dude, the most jaw-dropping legend, the biggest, baddest macro player out there, and the hardest game there was, with the hardest race there was. And if we look at even into his career up into ASL, he was like god tier from when he started in like the 07 or whatever up into 2010 in Brood War, and then was god tier into 2012 as well when early Star 2 was going on. Then he switched and was a top tier threat for several years. Then he went back to Brood War and won like over half the ASLs. They were literally rigging the map pool against Flash to the point where he was like, fuck it, I'll play random. And then he made it like all the way to the round of 4 anyway. Like, the guy's a god. Flash is the best ever. No one will ever compete with him in any esports since ever. And he was a legend. And no one can ever touch him. Ever. Ever. That's the video. Sub for more.